I shall die a horrible death, but the world has never seen such a terror and such a sea of blood as it shall now see. With this dark prophecy, the so-called Mad Baron said farewell to Ferdynand Ossendowski, a Polish expatriate fleeing from the Red Terror of the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia. Yes, the Baron was quite right in his last words to Ossendowski. His death was anything but glorious and heroic. He died at the hands of his own sworn mortal enemy, the Bolsheviks, and their Red Army, who seized power in Russia a few years earlier, and ever since hunted their adversaries, the remaining monarchists and anti-Bolshevik white forces, deep into the dense woods of Siberia and far-away plains of Mongolia. It was the 15th of September, 1921, when Baron von Ungern-Sternberg was shot dead after a tribunal lasting for 7 hours. He died alone, far away from his ancestral home and also removed from the kingdom that he ruled for a brief time, and where he was hailed as a war god incarnate. But for the Bolsheviks, he was just one of many renegade officers formerly serving in the army of Tsarist Russia, an insurgent taking up arms against the new powers that be, and attempting to roll back the communist Red Revolution in St. Petersburg and Moscow. He would no doubt be long forgotten by now, like so many other white officers fighting in vain against the Soviet Union. But he is not. Today we still remember and talk about this extraordinary man and his brief, yet epic life and struggle. Oswald Spengler, the heralder of the decline of the West, mentioned the Baron in a speech he held in Würzburg, 3 years after the death of Ungern-Sternberg. Around 1920, in Central Asia, there appeared as a free corps leader the Baron Ungern von Sternberg, who managed to gather, in a short period of time, an army of allegedly 150,000 men, fiercely loyal to him, trained skillfully and willing to go wherever the Baron commanded them to be. This man was killed by the Bolsheviks not long after. But if he'd succeeded, we couldn't tell what events would have unfolded in Asia, and how the world map would have been reshaped today. Robert Maximilian Friedrich von Ungern-Sternberg was most likely born on December 29, 1885 in Graz, Austria, though even basic details of his life are contested by history. His parents divorced before he was 6 years old. Shipped off to Estonia to be raised by his stepfather, he took a new name, Roman Fedorovich von Ungern-Sternberg. He came from Baltic German aristocracy, a world of old titles, old blood, and older ideas about order and hierarchy. The Baron claimed descent from Attila the Hun, from crusaders, from pirates. Whether or not those stories are true, they tell you something about the man who told them. From a young age, Roman had one ambition, and that was war. He enrolled at the Pavlovsk Military Academy in St. Petersburg. But when the Russo-Japanese War broke out, he didn't wait to graduate. He dropped out and immediately joined a Cossack unit, desperate to get into the fighting. Once he arrived in the Far East, he was wounded, repeatedly. It never seemed to slow him down. His superiors found him reckless, borderline insubordinate, but impossible to dismiss, because on the battlefield he was extraordinary. And it wasn't just the combat that captured him, it was the East itself. The Japanese impressed him deeply, with their warrior culture, their fearlessness, their devotion to their emperor, the vast Siberian landscape, the Mongols, their history and their stoicism. All of it had an effect on him. He returned to complete his academy training, but the seeds of something deeper had been planted. When Russia entered World War I in 1914, Ungern-Sternberg finally had the stage he needed. He served in the Nerchinsk Cossacks under General Pyotr Wrangel, fighting alongside a man who would later become a key figure in the Russian Civil War, Grigory Semenov. On the Galician front, clashing with German and Austro-Hungarian forces, he earned a reputation that followed him for the rest of his life. Ferocious, fanatical, seemingly fearless of death. He was awarded the Cross of St. George, one of the most prestigious military honors in Imperial Russia. He wore it every single day for the rest of his life. General Wrangel, his commanding officer, summed him up in a sentence that has never been bettered. The type that is invaluable in wartime and impossible in times of peace. But the war that defined Ungern-Sternberg wasn't the one being fought in the trenches of Galicia. It was the one that erupted at home. In 1917, the Russian Revolution swept away everything the Baron believed in. Tsar Nicholas II abdicated, the old world crumbled, and in the chaos that followed, two armies formed. The Reds, formed of the Bolsheviks, the Communists, and the Whites, a fractious coalition of monarchists, nationalists, and anti-communist forces of every stripe. Ungern-Sternberg was fanatically, uncompromisingly white, and fanatically, uncompromisingly monarchist. For him, this was never merely a political conflict. The communists weren't just political enemies. They were, in his view, the enemies of God, the enemies of the very concept of the divine. They were a plague on the soul of mankind. And against a plague, you do not compromise, you do not negotiate, you annihilate. He joined forces with General Semenov in the Russian Far East, raiding Bolshevik supply lines, recruiting soldiers, living off the land with efficiency. In 1918, he issued his own manifesto. His aim was to overthrow the Bolsheviks and restore Grand Duke Mikhail Romanov to the Russian throne. He didn't yet know that the Grand Duke had already been murdered by the communists. Had he known, it would only have deepened his fury. By 1920, the White cause was collapsing. Semenov's forces were being pushed out of Russia by the overwhelming weight of the Red Army. Alliances were fracturing. The White Russian government under Admiral Kolchak was disintegrating. Even Semenov himself had broken from Kolchak, entering negotiations with Japan for the creation of a puppet state. And Ungern-Sternberg had broken from Semenov. Those who knew the Baron in this period describe a man who was physically unremarkable, thin, frail-looking, small head, uneven eyes, a rather high-pitched voice, nothing that would make him stand out in a crowd. Except that he never seemed to tire, never seemed to feel cold or hunger or fear, and his eyes unsettled everyone who met him. By now, rumors swirled about the state of his mind. Some said the saber wound he had taken across his skull had done something to him. Others believed the accumulated weight of the Great War and the Civil War, all that death, all that destruction, all the blood he had witnessed and spilled, had finally cracked something inside him. Tales circulated of executions, of tortures, of acts of violence so extreme that witnesses later claimed they could not recognize what remained as human. His own physician described him as bloodthirsty and mentally unhinged. It is worth noting that most of these accounts came from Soviet sources, the sworn enemies of the fiercely monarchist Baron, with every reason to paint him as the blackest possible villain. The truth, as always, is harder to find than the legend. But whatever the truth, the most extraordinary chapter of his life was still ahead of him. And this is the fun part, the big turning point. He rode into Mongolia in late 1920. He came with a motley private army, Siberian Cossacks, Buryats, Kalmyks, Japanese mercenaries, and various Mongol and Manchu fighters, what he called his Asiatic Cavalry Division. The Bagd Khan, the Buddhist spiritual and temporal ruler of Mongolia, had been overthrown and placed under house arrest by Chinese Republican forces following the collapse of the Qing dynasty. He was desperate for help from any quarter. Ungern-Sternberg was invited, and he was more than willing. He immersed himself in his new surroundings entirely. He donned Mongol robes. He studied the Mongolian language. He pored over the history of the great Mongol Empire. His religious life became something unique and difficult to categorize. Born a Lutheran, he never formally renounced Christianity, but he consulted Buddhist lamas and local shamans, accepted Eastern ideas about fate and karma, and wore a heavy cord of amulets and religious charms beneath his uniform at all times. The Dalai Lama eventually declared him an incarnation of the wrathful deity Mahakala. His plan was breathtaking in its ambition. He would drive out the Chinese Republicans, restore the Bagd Khan, and then use Mongolia as the base for a vast, new Eurasian empire, a monarchist bulwark stretching from Mongolia through Manchuria into Siberia, allied with Japan, that would sweep the Bolsheviks from Russia and restore the Romanov dynasty to the throne. Most people look at this and say it was madness. The Baron called it a plan. And in the short term, it actually kind of worked. On the night of his assault on Urga, the Mongolian capital, now known as Ulaanbaatar, he had his men light fires on every surrounding hillside to give the impression of a massive, besieging army. The Chinese Republicans, terrified, did not know how few men actually faced them. And then the Baron led the charge himself on a white horse, wielding nothing but his bamboo walking stick. The Chinese broke. Urga fell. On March 13th, 1921, Mongolia was proclaimed independent once again. The Bagh Khan was restored to his throne amid celebration throughout the country. The grateful Khan showered the Baron with honors and titles. And then he got to work. His headquarters was a simple Mongol yurt in the courtyard of a Chinese home, sparsely furnished. His personal habits were Spartan to the point of austerity, and despite his fearsome reputation, he was a strict disciplinarian. He harshly punished his own troops for crimes against civilians, drunkenness, and looting. Under his authority, Urga got a telephone network, public transportation, a wireless station, hospitals, schools, a veterinary clinic, and a printing press. He insisted at every turn that the Bagh Khan was the ultimate authority, and he no more than the commander of the army. But Moscow was watching. The Soviets had already set their sights on Mongolia as their first satellite state. They were grooming a new generation of Mongolian communists, men like Damdin Sukbatar, later celebrated as the Lenin of Mongolia, and Khorlujin Khoibalsan, who would eventually earn the grim title of the Stalin of Mongolia for the blood he would spill. And Ungern-Sternberg was, in their view, the most dangerous man alive. Others who threatened him were all talk, but the Baron was just crazy enough to actually try it. In May of 1921, he marched his army back across the border into Russia, seeking the climactic confrontation he had been building toward for years. He believed the Russian peasantry, in their hearts, were still loyal to the Tsar. He believed that once he arrived, they would rally to him, and together they would wash the Marxist stain from the motherland. His cavalry hit the Soviet forces like a storm. For a month, they raided and scattered everything they encountered. But there's never going to be a happy ending here. His force was almost entirely mounted cavalry, few machine guns, no artillery, no air support. The Red Army at this point had trucks, planes, and effectively unlimited manpower. In July of 1921, the hammer came down. Surrounded and overwhelmed, Ungern-Sternberg did not surrender. He charged. He announced they would retreat to Tibet and regroup, and then a portion of his own troops, broken, exhausted, terrified, mutinied and tried to kill him. They couldn't do it. Even at the end, some quality in him made men too afraid to finish the job. Instead, they bound him and left him on the steppe. A Red Army patrol found him there, half naked, charms around his neck, staring at them from the ground. The last monarchist general in the field had been taken. They paraded him through Siberia like a circus exhibit, stopping at every station to display him to the crowds. The Soviets needed the monster they had built. They needed the terrifying Baron to be as terrible as they had promised. In September 1921, a military tribunal convened. The outcome was never in question. The prosecutor, known even by Bolshevik standards as a fanatical atheist, used the trial to deliver lengthy speeches about the evils of religious devotion of any kind. The Baron said very little. He had accepted his situation as the fate of the defeated. But when he did speak, he spoke coherently and calmly, with a clarity that surprised those who expected a raving animal. He objected to one thing on the record, that his forces had never harmed women. He was found guilty and sentenced to death. On September 17, 1921, Baron Roman von Ungern-Sternberg was executed by firing squad. Before the shots were fired, he swallowed his cross of St. George so that the godless communists could never take it from him. And as he fell, a piece of shrapnel from one of his amulets flew back and wounded one of the soldiers who shot him. Even in death, the Mad Baron was still drawing blood. Back in Mongolia, the Bagh Khan ordered Buddhist prayers to be said for the Baron in every temple in the country. In Moscow, Soviet doctors dissected his body looking for a scientific explanation for what he had been. They couldn't find one. The life of Baron von Ungern-Sternberg lasted not much longer than 35 years, but it is nothing short of extraordinary, to say the least, and there is so much more to it than what meets the eye. According to Ferdinand Ossendowski, Roman von Ungern-Sternberg once told him, "My name is surrounded with such hate and fear that no one can judge what is truth and what is false, what is history and what myth." Hermann Graf Kesserling believed that for the most part of his life, Roman von Ungern-Sternberg was a severely divided personality who could either be holy or be cruel, or be both in the starkest expression, but would be unable to reconcile the tension caused by opposing forces in one and the same personality. Roman von Ungern-Sternberg's biological father is said to have been committed to a mental asylum once, and to some observers this would explain that he was too mentally unstable. But by all accounts, no hard evidence of any hereditary madness could ever be found in the family history of the Ungern-Sternberg. Roman von Ungern-Sternberg was surely called the Mad Baron or Bloody Baron for the violence and bloodshed he had inflicted upon others, with torturing those suspected to be Red spies. However, the instances of arbitrary killings and mass murder in the Russian Civil War can hardly be deemed exclusive to Baron von Ungern-Sternberg, so there must be something else but violence and murder that set him apart from any other warlord on either side of the battlefield. Something out of the ordinary that prompted many of his contemporaries to deem him insane. One of the first things that set him apart was his insistence on monarchy to an extreme. He was almost like a last living vestige of the Age of Empires, dropped into a modern world that increasingly rejected monarchy. Just look at the chaos of the First World War, the abdication of the Kaiser, the killing of the Romanovs. For all practical purposes, monarchy was dead in Russia and for most of Europe too. Not so for Ungern-Sternberg. He was obsessed with monarchy, to the point that this idea would set him at odds with every other leader of the white counter-revolution, in which many saw no point in returning to a status quo. Contrary to the spirit of the time, the zeitgeist, Baron von Ungern-Sternberg considered monarchy to be the only legitimate form of government for any people. Only in Mongolia, of all places, could the monarchist agenda of Baron von Ungern-Sternberg align with the political aspirations of a local ruler, the Bogd Khan, also known as Living Buddha. Baron von Ungern-Sternberg also acted as the epitome of a warrior and an ascetic. From his early teenage years, he seemed to have some sort of fascination with Tibetan and Hindu philosophy, and often spoke of mystical powers associated with geometrical symbols. That is according, again, to Hermann Graf Kesserling. In the battlefield, Baron von Ungern-Sternberg was a brave man, for all we know, even daring to the point of tempting and defying death. From his early time as a soldier and officer, whether in the Far East or later in Galicia and Poland, he could be found in the heat of the battle or volunteering for dangerous missions that took him behind enemy lines. Ungern-Sternberg would lead by example. He would ride and fight with his soldiers, share their meals, and sleep together with them under the same roof. Unlike other white officers, Ungern-Sternberg practiced an ascetic lifestyle that would have him avoid drinking alcohol. He is said to have been a heavy drinker at one point, a habit that apparently contributed to his lack of discipline, which caused him so many troubles in his early years as a student and soldier. With his stern attitude, the Baron was feared as well as revered by his soldiers, who knew that any misbehavior on their part would carry heavy-handed penalties, but loyalty and bravery would be rewarded likewise. It was his liberation of Urga, the capital of Mongolia, against all odds, that echoed in Western newspapers and made many aware of his name for the first time ever. How he was able to expel the Chinese occupation force from Mongolia, even though badly outnumbered and outgunned, certainly deserves the respect from any military strategist. Needless to say, but the reports from Mongolia became all the more exaggerated and twisted the farther they traveled, hence the legend of the Mad Baron, who ruled with an iron fist in an exotic and remote kingdom, could easily seize the imagination and fantasy of a Western audience receptive to tales from faraway places and daring adventurers. Kesserling called Ungern-Sternberg one of the most metaphysically and occultly gifted men I have ever met, and believed that the Baron was a clairvoyant who could read the minds of the people around him. We know from the travel report of Ferdinand Ossendowski that the gaze of Baron von Ungern-Sternberg was very unsettling, which has come up multiple times now. When they met for the first time, Ossendowski recalls, "His eyes were fixed upon me like those of an animal from a cave." Ossendowski witnessed how a bunch of prisoners were brought to Ungern-Sternberg, who would stare at them for a long time until he finally proclaimed who, from among them, must be commissars of the Communist Party, and as it turned out, documents proving their espionage activities were found on the two prisoners he had singled out. They were beaten to death on his command. That Baron von Ungern-Sternberg is believed to have been the incarnation of a pre-Buddhist god of war, recognized by the local spiritual leader as a descendant of the fabled Genghis Khan, and thus, being one of the last Khans of Mongolia himself, quite certainly must be considered the most intriguing aspect to his legend. This was the moment when Baron von Ungern-Sternberg became immortal in his lifetime already. He was prophesied by Mongolian seers that he would only have 133 more days left to live, as he told Ossendowski when they met in Urga. He expected to die, not as the victor but as the vanquished, yet he feared not. He knew that his death was meant to be the ultimate sacrifice from which the myth, transcending the ages, would blossom and rise forth. Only the myth can conquer death, and hence his death, as gloomy as it was, could only add to the legend of his life. Betrayed by the last of his men, captured by his mortal enemy but remaining defiant until the very end, not surrendering ever, and never once asking for mercy or begging for his life. He died the same way that he lived, as a true enemy to the world that he hated and wished to tear asunder, so his vision of a new world could ultimately manifest in reality. When the bullets of the Red Army firing squad hit him, he truly lived up to the words of Ernest Hemingway. But man is not made for defeat. A man can be destroyed but not be defeated.